For the last 50 years, an unspoken rule has quietly governed the North American continent. Through every global crisis, market panic, or distant war that threatened the world's oil supply, the United States has counted on one unshakable guarantee to keep its economy running: the steady, uninterrupted flow of Canadian energy. It was the one certainty in a world full of volatility. The bedrock of American energy security wasn't found in Texas or Alaska. It was piped in from Alberta. This relationship was more than convenient. It was a core pillar of American strategic planning. The world's biggest economy lived right next door to a friendly, stable democracy that supplied more oil to the U.S. than all of OPEC combined. This created a sense of permanent security, a belief that no matter how chaotic things got, the neighbor to the north would always be there, ready to open the taps. But what if that guarantee, the one that generations of policymakers took for granted, officially broke? What if the bedrock itself began to fracture? Let's explore a hypothetical scenario. Imagine a new global oil shock is here, born from a fiery crisis in the Middle East. But this time, the crisis is different. This time, Canada isn't riding to the rescue. In fact, it's doing the exact opposite. As the world scrambles for barrels, Canada makes a calculated, strategic power play, leaving its largest trading partner dangerously exposed. A tectonic shift in power is underway. This is the story of how Canada, after decades of being a dependable resource depot, could theoretically seize control of its destiny and gain astonishing energy leverage over the United States. In our scenario, the crisis begins, as they so often do, in the world's most volatile choke point. Let's imagine that in the early hours of February 28, 2026, coordinated strikes hit strategic assets in Iran. The geopolitical fallout is catastrophic. In retaliation, the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow artery for a torrent of global oil, is effectively shut down. Almost overnight, the global market feels a historic tremor. To get the scale of this hypothetical event, you have to understand the strait's importance. Roughly 14 million barrels of crude oil pass through this waterway on any given day. It is the single most critical transit point for global energy. Its closure wouldn't just squeeze the market. It would threaten to suffocate it. In this scenario, the International Energy Agency, IEA, makes a grim announcement. The world is facing the largest supply disruption in history, forecasting a plunge in global supply by a staggering 8 million barrels per day. The reaction is instant and brutal. Gulf producers like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, their main export routes severed, are forced to slash production. Brent crude, the global benchmark, shoots past $100 a barrel. The IEA, desperate to calm the panic, announces the largest ever coordinated release of emergency reserves, a theoretical 400 million barrels. This would be the definition of a global oil shock. In past crises, the United States always had a secret weapon: Canada. While Europe and Asia paid sky-high prices for tanker-borne crude, America could always just turn north. But as the markets burn in early March 2026, a chilling realization would begin to dawn in Washington. The phone in Ottawa would be ringing, but this time the answer would be different. Canada isn't going to turn on the taps. In fact, it's preparing to turn them down. In this scenario, the oil shock isn't a catastrophe for Canada. It's the opportunity it has been quietly preparing for. To really grasp the magnitude of Canada's hypothetical power play, you have to understand the dynamic it would shatter. For years, the energy relationship between the U.S. and Canada wasn't exactly a partnership of equals. It was a classic case of what economists call a monopsony, a market with only one real buyer, and that buyer was America. For most of its history as an oil powerhouse, Canada faced a huge problem. Its vast reserves, mostly in landlocked Alberta, had only one cost-effective way to get to market: south. A massive web of pipelines was built with a compass needle that pointed directly at the U.S. industrial heartland. This system was great at moving oil, but it locked Canada into a dependent relationship. In 2024, a stunning 96% of Canada's exported oil went straight to the USA. The United States, in turn, got hooked on this deal. American refineries, especially in the Midwest and on the Gulf Coast, invested billions to specifically process Canadian heavy crude. These weren't minor tweaks. Entire facilities were retooled for Canadian feedstock. It made perfect economic sense. American refiners could buy discounted Canadian crude, process it, and sell the gasoline and diesel at a handsome profit. By 2024, the numbers were breathtaking. Canada exported about $103 billion worth of crude oil to the U.S. That represented a physical flow of roughly 4 million barrels every single day. This supply accounted for over 60% of all American crude oil imports and made up over 23% of the total oil running through the entire U.S. refinery system. For Midwest refineries, that number was closer to 70%. For a long time, this was hailed as a win for North American energy security. But for Canada, it was a gilded cage. Being tied to a single customer left the country vulnerable. If the U.S. decided to use this dependence for leverage in trade talks, what could Canada do? Canadian producers were forced to accept lower prices, costing their economy billions. America wasn't just buying Canada's oil, it was buying it at a bargain. This vulnerability wasn't lost on Ottawa. For years, they dreamed of breaking the American monopsony. They dreamed of pipelines that ran not just south, but west, to the deep water ports of the Pacific and the energy-hungry markets of Asia. For a decade, that dream seemed stalled. But then quietly, the pieces began falling into place. The final critical piece, a steel artery known as the Trans Mountain Expansion, clicked into place in May of 2024. The completion of the Trans Mountain Expansion, TMX, wasn't just another pipeline. It was a potential declaration of independence. For the first time, Canada had a high-capacity direct route for its oil to reach the ocean, completely bypassing the United States. The project tripled the system's capacity to a formidable 890,000 barrels per day, all flowing from Alberta to the port of Vancouver. The impact was immediate. Tankers began leaving British Columbia filled with Canadian crude and sailing for new destinations. While the U.S. remained the dominant buyer, the shift was noticeable. In the first few months of 2025, Canada's crude exports to non-U.S. markets jumped to nearly 400,000 barrels per day. The primary destination, Asia. China quickly became a major customer, with imports of Canadian crude soaring. In just 1 year, the share of Canadian oil exports going to non-U.S. markets grew from around 6% to 15%. 1 in every 6 barrels leaving Canada was now going somewhere other than America. This newfound flexibility gave Canada options it never had before. Now let's re-enter our hypothetical scenario. Imagine that just as TMX is fully operational, trade tensions with the U.S. boil over, leading to American tariffs on Canadian energy in 2025. In the past, this would have crippled Canada's energy sector. But now, with TMX online, it could have the opposite effect, hardening Canada's resolve to pivot away. And then comes the global shock from our scenario, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz in late February 2026. The U.S. reels from the supply crunch and instinctively looks north for help, but it's met with a stunning development. Citing the need to ensure its own domestic supply and meet obligations to new, high-paying partners, Canada makes its move. It announces a hypothetical 40% reduction in crude oil flows to the United States. This wouldn't be a negotiation. It would be a unilateral decision made possible by the new reality of TMX. The barrels that would have gone to Illinois and Ohio would instead be directed west, to tankers bound for Shanghai and Mumbai. For decades, Canada was a price taker. Now, in the middle of a global crisis, it would become a price maker. The leverage had shifted. In our hypothetical crisis, the consequences of Canada's 40% crude reduction would hit the United States like a physical blow. Already grappling with a global shock, the U.S. would now face a second energy crisis right on its own border. The loss of nearly 1.6 million barrels per day of secure Canadian crude, is a scenario the American energy system simply isn't built for. The most immediate impact would be on U.S. refineries. Those Midwest facilities optimized for Canadian crude would be starved of feedstock. You can't just swap heavy Canadian crude for light Texas oil. The machinery isn't designed for it. The result? A dangerous slowdown. Projections in this scenario might warn that U.S. refinery capacity could plummet, guaranteeing fuel shortages and brutal price spikes. States like Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio would face the worst of it. Washington would turn to its emergency playbook. As of early 2026, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, SPR, holds over 400 million barrels. Script fictional. But a massive release would be a temporary fix for a huge problem. It can't replace the sustained daily flow of the specific type of crude its refineries need. A 40% cut from Canada would put an unbearable strain on the already depleted reserve. The U.S. would look abroad for other options, but the picture would be bleak. Mexico's own production has declined, and Venezuela remains an unreliable partner. The very system built on the assumption of endless Canadian supply would be hopelessly exposed. The United States, a nation that consumes 20 million barrels of oil a day while producing around 13 million, would be caught in a strategic vice. The geopolitical fallout would be just as severe. The long-held belief in a unified, insulated fortress North America would be shattered. In this scenario, Canada is acting in its own self-interest, prioritizing new customers willing to pay a premium. The tables have completely turned. For years, the U.S. held the leverage. Now, Canada would hold the ultimate trump card, control over the one commodity its neighbor cannot live without. This hypothetical pivot by Canada raises profound questions for the future of American energy security. What should the United States do to regain energy independence if its most reliable source became a competitor? Is a more integrated North American energy policy the answer, or is it time for America to radically rethink its consumption from the ground up? Let us know what you think the U.S. strategy should be in the comments below. What moves would you make if you were in the White House facing this scenario? And if you found this analysis valuable, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the forces shaping our world. What we've just explored is more than a hypothetical crisis. It's a thought experiment based on real-world shifts. The long-held assumption of American energy dominance on its own continent is being challenged. The pipeline that once felt like a one-way street from Alberta to your local gas station now has a major off-ramp leading to Asia. By completing one critical piece of infrastructure, the Trans Mountain expansion, Canada has fundamentally changed its position. We've imagined a scenario where it seizes a moment of global chaos to transform itself from a passive resource supplier into a decisive global energy player. The United States, which benefited for so long from a lopsided relationship, would find itself on the back foot, facing a stark new reality. The hypothetical oil shock of 2026 would be remembered not just for market panic, but for the permanent power shift it could trigger in North America. The continent's energy map has been redrawn, and with it, the future of the relationship between two of the world's closest allies has entered a new, uncertain era.